With Blade Runner 2049 coming out into theaters this weekend, I'm sure a lot of other people, have gone back and revisited the original in preparation for the new movie. One of the things that really struck me on this watch through was the opening sequence of the film. No, not the scene with the interrogation, but the scene right before that where we see the landscape of Los Angeles 2019 for the first time. It's a gorgeous bit of filmmaking and one that's really fascinating visually. Unfortunately, I think it's also one that opens up the film to a lot of the criticism it tends to get, namely that Blade Runner is a movie that stresses style over substance. I actually disagree with that take quite a bit, though I understand where it comes from. So what I'd like to do today is take a closer look at that opening sequence and try and show how, well, it certainly is very stylized. It's actually a case not of style over substance, but of style becoming substance. In other words, it's a scene that sets the tone for the movie, that draws out a lot of the themes that we're about to experience in the story, and hopefully is one that not only wows us visually, but gets us to think. Let's start out by just taking a look at this sequence. It's about a minute long. We'll let it play as it runs in the original movie, and then I'll come back and I'll do some commentary over it. There are a couple of things to take note of here in this opening sequence. The first is that it's made up of a combination of objective and subjective shots. If you're not familiar with that terminology, all that it means is that a subjective shot is a shot that's from the point of view of a character or sometimes even an object in the film, whereas an objective shot is not. Now, what's interesting about this sequence in terms of objective and subjective cinema is that it initially appears that we're experiencing an objective shot, but that turns out to not be the case. When we eventually do get our first objective shot, it's of the eyeball, the extreme close-up with the cityscape reflected in its vision. All the other shots in this sequence are actually subjective from the perspective of that eyeball, whoever's it happens to be. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. So that's the first thing to note about this scene, but what really struck me about it is actually that extreme close-up of the eyeball itself, namely because it reminded me of a shot in my favorite movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, I'm not going to claim that Ridley Scott is directly referencing the shot of David Bowman's eyeball at the end of the Stargate sequence in 2001, though it's certainly possible that he could be. But what I would like to argue in this video is that there's a thematic tie between this sequence here in Blade Runner and the Stargate sequence in 2001. And I think by taking a closer look at some of the stuff that goes on in 2001's Stargate sequence, particularly as it obtains to David Bowman and the objective and subjective imagery, we can get a better appreciation for what Ridley Scott is doing here in this opening scene and how it can help us to understand the rest of the movie. So let's take a look at 2001 before we talk more about Blade Runner. Now, I'm not going to play the whole Stargate sequence for you. It's quite long, as you know if you've ever seen the movie. But I'm going to let a few sequences play here while we discuss it a little bit. There's a few things to take note of here in the Stargate sequence. The first is that, like the scene in Blade Runner, this is a mix of objective and subjective shots. Now, I suppose it's possible that it could be all subjective shots if we posit the possibility that whoever or whatever is sending David Bowman through the Stargate is watching him, and that's what we're seeing when we see the shots of him. But for the purpose of simplicity, let's just keep this to objective and subjective, with the subjective shots being the shots we actually see of what's going on inside of the Stargate. Those are from David Bowman's perspective, and the objective shots being the shots of him. Now, if you notice on the objective shots, they actually start with his whole head. We kind of see him from the shoulders up, and we see the Stargate reflected in his visor, much like we saw the cityscape reflected in the eye in Blade Runner. But pretty soon, that starts to change. We see a number of still images of him kind of interspliced in the sequence that show him seeming to suffer or to fall asleep or some combination thereof. From that point on, all of the objective shots in the sequence are, like Blade Runner, extreme close-ups of his eye. We see them filtered through several different colors until we get to the very end of the sequence when he blinks a number of times. With each blink, the color overlying his eye changes until it finally appears unfiltered with the final blink. Now, if you've seen 2001, you know that like many sequences in the film, this is kind of a complicated one to break down. It's not initially obvious what Stanley Kubrick was going for. And I certainly don't claim to be any expert on the scene or to have a definitive answer for you. This is, after all, my interpretation. But with that disclaimer, let me offer a few thoughts that I think can help us both understand this sequence here in 2001 and then later connect over to Blade Runner. So I want to point out three things that I think this Stargate sequence does that are significant, particularly the focus on David Bowman's eye and this extreme close-up that we see. The first thing that it does is it puts him on a level of the character of Hal, the malevolent computer who plays such a big role in the second act of the movie. Now, if you've seen 2001, or even if you've only seen some pictures of it, you know that Hal appears as a single red glowing eye. He's a sort of Cyclops figure throughout the film. His eye appears any number of places throughout the starship, and he always appears to be watching. He and David Bowman are antagonists throughout that second act, with Bowman eventually gaining the upper hand and shutting down Hal once and for all just before he goes through the Stargate. But by having this extreme close-up of David Bowman's eye and repeating it so often throughout the Stargate sequence, I think one of the things Stanley Kubrick is trying to do is establish a leveling between David Bowman and Hal. There's a sense of that the difference between them, mainly that David Bowman is a man and that Hal is a machine, is ultimately irrelevant, just as it was irrelevant in their battle. They both are creatures who wanted to ascend into whatever the monolith offers in 2001. They're both creatures fighting for their own survival. And even though at this point in the movie Bowman has won, we're supposed to remember that his victory over Hal was not due to his being superior, because he's a human and Hal's a computer, but simply because he happened to come out on top. There's a certain happy accident quality to it. If David Bowman wants to benefit from whatever it is the monoliths offer him, he's going to have to reduce himself to the level of all other sentient life. He's going to have to humble himself and let go of a sense of superiority and get on that even playing field with Hal and the other creatures we see throughout the film. The second thing that this emphasis does is it reduces the character of David Bowman to a single feature, particularly his eye. What that tells us is that what David Bowman is going through, this transcendent experience of going beyond the infinite, as the film puts it, is a visual experience. He is transformed first and foremost by what he sees, and in a sense, if it wasn't for that emphasis on vision, perhaps he would not be able to obtain his status at the end of the film as the Star Child. Stanley Kubrick wants us to remember that whatever other senses and experiences are involved in the transcendent, it is first and foremost a visual experience. Finally, this sequence functions as a commentary on cinema itself. There are only 40 minutes of dialogue in 2001, which, given that it's almost 2.5 hours, tends to throw off new viewers a little bit. It certainly runs contrary to our expectations for how a movie is going to operate. But on top of that, even within that 40 minutes, much of the dialogue is inconsequential. We see astronauts talking about sandwiches. We see a man calling home to his daughter. We see parents sending a video birthday card to their son. Very little of the dialogue actually enhances the plot or moves things forward. Why is that? Well, I think it ties into what we were talking about just a moment ago. It's that theme of seeing. Kubrick wants not only David Bowman to be transformed through what he sees, he wants us in the cinema to be transformed through what we see. And so this sequence, as with much of 2001, becomes a commentary on cinema itself. Are we in the audience willing to enter into that transcendent experience that only cinema can offer, where we are transformed not by what we think about, not by what we hear, but by what we see? So what does all that have to do with Blade Runner? Well, as I said before, I'm not going to claim that there's a formal connection between this scene in Blade Runner and 2001. However, I think we can use the Stargate sequence and the things we just talked about as a sort of interpretive key for what's going on in this opening minute of the film. Let's take it point by point. First, we talked about how the close-up in 2001 levels the playing field between David Bowman and Hal. I would argue that the extreme close-up of the eye here at the beginning of Blade Runner has much the same effect. For starters, we have no idea whose eye it is. Is it a human's? Is it a replicant? Does it even matter? Those are questions that Blade Runner wants us to think about throughout the film. We understand conceptually that there's a difference between a human and a replicant, and we can point to what many of those differences are. Yet for all intents and purposes, the replicants in the film seem just as human as the humans, and sometimes the humans seem more robotic than the replicants. In fact, we're not even always sure who is who. Is Deckard a replicant? Can we be sure? And again, doesn't matter. This extreme close-up where we can't see any of the other features of the actor lends a high degree of anonymity to the moment. We don't know who we're looking at, and we're forced to conclude that it doesn't matter. It's not going to change what we see. What matters is the experience of the person who's taking in this glorious and frightening landscape before him or her. In fact, if we really want to push this point, in a sense, that eye that we're seeing could actually be our eyes of the audience. Again, let's go back to the use of subjective shots that is going on in the sequence. By using subjective shots, the vision of that person, whoever it happens to be, becomes our vision. We're forced to identify with that character, and if that character is a replicant, then it's not just the line between the human characters and the replicant characters in the film that's blurred. It's the line between the replicants and us. We're forced to take on that same perspective. We're forced to put ourselves into the shoes of whoever it is experiencing this vision. Second, just as Stanley Kubrick used the extreme close-up of David Bowman's eyes to establish the importance of vision in Bowman's transcendence, Ridley Scott uses this extreme close-up to establish the importance of sight and vision as a theme in his movie. Eyes are all over the place in Blade Runner. You have the extreme close-up of the eye that takes place during the Voight-Kampff test that can allegedly determine whether or not somebody's a replicant. Roy Batty, when we first meet him, is interrogating the maker of the synthetic eyes. Dr. Eldon Tyrell, who's the real villain of the piece in my opinion, is the only one who doesn't seem to have perfect vision, as he wears these massive and very thick glasses over his eyes. And finally, of course, there's Roy's famous speech at the end, where he talks about the things that he's seen and how those will be lost when he's gone. So eyes are all over the place in Blade Runner, but what's Ridley Scott actually trying to say with that? Well, again, there's a certain degree of subjectivity here, and I'm not going to claim that my analysis is exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that one of the points that Blade Runner makes with this emphasis on sight is that vision functions as a primary mode of being. Here's what I mean by that. We learn fairly early on in the movie that Rachel's memories are synthetic. They are implants from Tyrell's niece, allegedly anyway. So memory's not very reliable in Blade Runner. And when Rachel finds this out, it's devastating to her. She feels as though her whole self has been destroyed, and in a sense it has. But Rachel's redemption in the movie, to the degree that she actually experiences it, is the ability to move on from memory, to not simply live based on these implanted memories, but to form a new identity based on her own memories, her real memories, the things that she sees. to form her own version of what Roy describes when he talks about seeing attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. And the same goes for Deckard. We don't know whether or not he's a replicant for sure in the film, and if you've spent much time reading commentary online, you know that this is certainly a hot topic of debate. But to a certain extent, whether or not he is a replicant is irrelevant. He's certainly a broken down man when we meet him at the beginning of the movie, whatever the case may be. The challenge for Deckard is to live his life well, to go forward and to make new memories, to experience things in the same way that Roy did. And it's through vision that that's going to happen. For Ridley Scott, one of the things he wants to get across to us is the importance of sight and vision in terms of forming ourselves, forming our beings, and creating who we are. If we can't trust our memories, and maybe we can't, we can always trust what's right in front of our eyes. That will always offer us a degree of transcendence that nothing else can compete with. Finally, as with 2001, I see this sequence as being a commentary on cinema. Now, it's a commentary that we won't really be able to see until we have the whole film in our perspective. But if there's a tragic element to all of this emphasis on sight in Blade Runner, it's at the end of Roy Batty's speech, where he talks about how he's going to lose these memories, these things he's seen when he dies. And it's a loss not only for him, but for all of us. Whenever someone dies, we lose their vision, we lose their experience. But cinema is the exception for that. The camera is the eye that doesn't forget. Its memories aren't washed away like tears in the rain. They're permanent. It's always there for us to go and look at again, to think about some more, and to pass on to new viewers even long after the directors and actors are gone. Again, we come back to that use of subjective vision. By using a subjective shot, a director is able to take us inside the head of a character, preserve his or her memories and vision. It's an experience that no other medium is able to offer, and Ridley Scott does it brilliantly here. And that's why for me, this sequence isn't simply a case of style over substance, but of style becoming substance. While we might not see it on the first viewing, Ridley Scott is actually putting his cards on the table and showing us the themes that he's about to explore in the movie. Blade Runner is a challenging film in that it doesn't hold your hand. It's one that requires something of you, and probably requires a few viewings in order to really understand. As I've said, I don't claim to have a final answer on what this sequence means or what the film means as a whole, but hopefully this has given you an opportunity to look at the movie in a new light, and maybe this sequence in a new light. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and let me know your own thoughts on Blade Runner. One of the best things about this movie is its ability to spark discussion. And I know I have my fingers crossed, hoping that Blade Runner 2049 will be exactly the same. A great film that will live on for years and years and will have us thinking and feeling long after the credits roll.